He must have ordered her by the pound. The judge's wife mocked until only she could save her son. The town of Providence was a God-fearing place, a small island of order in a vast, untamed wilderness. But beneath the surface it simmered with the scrutinizing silence, a brittle pride, and the constant threat of a looming judgment. Eleanor stepped down from the stagecoach, smoothing the wrinkles from her traveling dress. Her movements were calm, her chin held high with an unwavering grace, even as a dozen pairs of eyes dissected her. She saw her betrothed, the blacksmith Isaac, and his kind, hopeful face was a welcome shore in a sea of cold appraisal. But it was the stare of the judge's wife, Beatrice Croft, that held the real power as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of winter ice. What the town saw was a plain, stout woman, a mail-order bride bought by a lonely man. What they couldn't see was the secret she carried, a collection of her father's journals filled with the culinary and herbal wisdom of New Orleans. This knowledge was her true dowry, her real inheritance, her ace in the hole. The high and mighty women of Providence believed they were judging a simple woman they could easily break. They had no idea they weren't just welcoming a new wife into their town. They were starting a war with the only person who held the recipe for their own survival. The town of Providence was a God-fearing place, which meant it was a place that lived in constant scrutinizing fear. It was a collection of stark, upright buildings under a wide, unforgiving sky, a town gripped by a brittle pride and the ever-present threat of looming judgment. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. It was the silence of a jury. When the stagecoach groaned to a halt in a cloud of alkali dust, that silence became a palpable living thing. Every curtain twitched. Every pair of eyes turned toward the door as it swung open. Eleanor stepped down into the harsh white glare of the afternoon sun. She smoothed the deep wrinkles from her traveling dress, a simple garment of dark wool, her movements calm and deliberate despite the exhaustion that clung to her bones. The journey had been long, a seemingly endless rattling that had shaken the world down to its essentials. She was here now. This was her new life. Her gaze swept over the faces, staring back at her, impassive, curious, and cold. So cold. She was searching for one kind face, a single beacon in a sea of appraisal. A man stepped forward, breaking from the small crowd of onlookers. He was broad-shouldered, his hands large and calloused from hard work, a smudge of soot still visible on his cheek. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over in a gesture of nervous anticipation. This was Isaac the blacksmith. Her future. His eyes, when they met hers, were not cold. They were kind, filled with a quiet, hopeful anxiety that immediately set him apart from the rest of Providence. "Miss Eleanor," he asked, his voice softer than she expected from a man his size. A genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in weeks. "Mr. Isaac, it is a pleasure to finally meet you." Her voice was steady, a clear, low melody against the town's silent judgment. "The pleasure is all mine," he said, a shy, grateful smile spreading across his own face. He reached for her heavy luggage, the bag containing her few worldly possessions. It was in that moment, in that small, simple act of welcome, that the town's verdict was delivered. Beatrice Croft, the judge's wife and the undisputed queen of the town's tight-lipped society, stood with a companion near the mercantile. She did not bother to lower her voice. "Good heavens, Martha Beatrice Stage," whispered her voice, sharp as a shard of ice. "Is that the blacksmith's mail order?" Her friend, a woman with a face like a dried apple, peered at Eleanor. "It must be. He's been waiting all week." Beatrice let out a small, cruel laugh that was perfectly audible in the stillness. He must have ordered her by the pound. The word struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. The heat of a deep, painful blush rose up her neck. For a moment, the world swam the faces of the townsfolk, blurring into a single monstrous, leering eye. She had traveled 1,000 miles, leaving behind a life of quiet grief, hoping for a new start, only to be weighed and found wanting in the first 5 minutes. All the grace, all the intelligence, all the warmth she possessed was rendered invisible, erased by a single casual cruelty about her size. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin a fraction higher. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. Isaac heard the comment, too. A dark flush of shame and anger crept up from his collar. He saw the flicker of pain in Eleanor's eyes, saw the way her composure became a brittle, beautiful armor. He was not a confrontational man. He had lived his life by the sweat of his brow and the simple rule of minding his own affairs. But this was his affair. This was his wife. He set her luggage down and, ignoring the snickering women, stepped to Eleanor's side. He gently but firmly took her arm. It was a public gesture, a declaration. "Pay them no mind, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice a low growl meant only for her. "Their hearts are as barren as the land. Welcome home." He led her away from the stagecoach, away from the whispers and the stares. They walked down the long, dusty street together, a quiet blacksmith and his mail-order bride, a mismatched pair who had just become an army of two. The battle for Providence had just begun. The blacksmith's home was small, a sturdy little house attached to the forge, smelling perpetually of coal smoke, hot iron, and the honest scent of sawdust. To Eleanor, after months on the trail and a lifetime in a city that never slept, it smelled like a sanctuary. In the first few days, a quiet, hopeful rhythm began to form between them. Isaac would rise before dawn, the steady rhythmic clang, clang, clang of his hammer on the anvil a heartbeat for their new life. Eleanor, in turn, transformed the dusty bachelor's quarters into a home. She didn't just clean, she nested. She found wild herbs by the creek bed to hang from the rafters, their sharp, clean scent mingling with the smoke. She baked bread, a beautiful round loaf each morning, its crust a perfect burnished gold. For the first time since his first wife had passed, Isaac came home not to a silent house, but to the smell of fresh bread and the warm, intelligent presence of a partner. He would watch her, his heart filled with a quiet, grateful awe. She was more than he had dared to hope for. But a home cannot be a fortress if the whole world outside is at war with it. Their first Sunday as a married couple was the first battle. Eleanor had baked her finest loaf, wrapping it in a clean linen cloth to share at the social after the service. It was a gesture of peace, an offering. She stood beside Isaac, her head held high, and smiled at the women who approached the refreshment table. Beatrice Croft, the judge's wife, glided toward them, her own smile as thin and brittle as glass. "Oh, bread, dear," she said, her eyes flicking over the beautiful loaf before dismissing it entirely. "How rustic." She turned to the woman next to her. "But my family has such a delicate constitution. We stick to simple fare." She picked up a dry plain biscuit from another plate and walked away. The message was clear. It was a public shunning. One by one, the other women followed suit, finding excuses, turning their backs, leaving Eleanor and her offering of peace, standing alone in a circle of icy silence. Isaac's hand found hers, his grip tight and angry, but he said nothing. He simply led her home, the untouched loaf of bread between them feeling as heavy as a gravestone. The whispers of that Sunday became the actions of the week. The chill followed them into town. Women who once greeted Isaac would now cross the street to avoid him. Children who used to play near the forge were called inside when Eleanor stepped out to sweep the porch. The cruelty was quiet, polite, and suffocating. Then it began to hit his livelihood. "Morning, Isaac," a rancher named Henderson said, shifting his feet awkwardly at the entrance to the forge. He wouldn't quite meet Isaac's eye. "Just came to pick up my tools." "They're ready," Isaac said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I reinforced the handle on that axe just like you asked. No charge for that." "Appreciate it," Henderson mumbled. "Look, Isaac, I'm going to be taking my wagon wheels over to Crimson Creek for shoeing next week. Isaac froze, the hammer in his hand suddenly heavy. Crimson Creek. That's a 2-day ride. I've been shoeing your horses for 10 years. I know, Henderson said, finally looking up, his face a mask of miserable apology. Nothing personal. It's just, well, the wife, she says that fellow over there has a new kind of forge, says it burns hotter. Just want to see what it's like. It was a flimsy, pathetic lie. Both men knew it. The poison of the town's judgment was now seeping into the iron and fire of Isaac's work, threatening to starve them out. That evening, the silence in the small house was heavy and sour. The steady rhythm of the forge had been replaced by an angry, frustrated quiet. Isaac paced the floor like a caged bear. He kicked at a loose floorboard. Another one today, he set his back to her. Thompson, taking his plows all the way to Crimson Creek. He finally turned his face, a storm of frustration and pain he didn't know how to unleash. Maybe they're right, Eleanor. Maybe this was a mistake. Eleanor, who had been kneading dough for the next day's bread, stilled her hands. She looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, heartbreaking clarity. A mistake to marry me, Isaac. She asked, her voice quiet, but cutting through his anger. Or a mistake to believe the friendship of this town was forged in anything stronger than convenience and fear. The question hung in the air between them. Isaac stared at her, the fury draining out of him, replaced by a wave of shame. She was right. He had been blaming her, the victim of the poison, instead of the poisoners themselves. He had let their smallness make him small. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. He placed his large, calloused hands over hers on the soft, waiting dough. No, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The mistake was mine, for thinking their judgment mattered more than my own. In that moment, their hands clasped together. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a union. The town had drawn its battle lines, and Isaac finally had chosen his side. The long, lean months of winter began to settle over Providence, draping the town in a shroud of gray skies and biting wind. The initial skirmish over Eleanor's arrival had cooled into a tense, frozen truce. She and Isaac had created a small island of warmth in their home, a sanctuary built of mutual respect and the steady rhythmic clang of the forge. He worked his loyalty to her, a silent, defiant answer to the town's cold shoulder. She cooked her meals, a quiet rebellion against the bleakness outside, coaxing flavor from the meager winter stores of salt pork, dried beans, and cornmeal. But as the snows deepened, a new and insidious visitor arrived in town. It did not come with the bang of a pistol or the shout of a preacher. It came as a whisper, a creeping, silent thief. It started with the children. First, it was young Martha Gable's boy, who lost his energy, his usually rosy cheeks turning a pale, doughy color. Then, the Miller twins grew listless, too tired to even quarrel. A strange lethargy fell over the town's youngest, a wasting sickness that stole their appetites and left them with a strange, hollow look in their eyes. Dr. Adams, a man whose medical knowledge was as old and worn as his leather bag, was baffled. He prescribed bed rest and foul-smelling tonics, but the sickness only deepened its grip. Fear, cold and sharp, began to permeate the town once more. At the mercantile, hushed conversations replaced idle gossip. "It's a wasting fever," one woman would say, her voice tight with worry. Dr. Adams says he's never seen the like. "It's a shadow," another would reply, her eyes darting nervously toward the street. A shadow fell over this town this autumn, a spiritual malaise. Eleanor heard the whispers. She saw the worry etched on the faces of mothers who hurried past her, clutching their children's hands. She felt the old judgment returning, but this time it was laced with a new, more dangerous element: superstition. The sentiment was given a voice, as it always was, by Beatrice Croft. She did not accuse Eleanor directly. Her methods were far more subtle and far more poisonous. "It is a trial sent to test our faith," she announced at a hastily called town meeting in the church hall, her voice ringing with grim authority. "When a community allows its standards to falter, when it welcomes elements that are not in keeping with a pious life, it opens the door to affliction. We must pray for our souls to be cleansed as well as our bodies. Her meaning was as clear as a shard of glass. The sickness was a punishment, and Eleanor was the sin. Isaac came home from that meeting, his face grim. "They're looking for someone to blame," he said, his voice low. "And they found her." One afternoon, Eleanor saw it herself. She watched from her window as Dr. Adams left the Croft residence, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Later, she saw Judge Croft standing on his porch, a powerful man made small by helplessness, staring out at the gray sky as if searching for an answer. The sickness had breached the walls of the town's most powerful family. Their son, Thomas, was now gravely ill. That evening, Eleanor sat by the fire, the sounds of Isaac's hammer a slow, troubled rhythm from the forge. She thought of the symptoms described in hushed, fearful tones, the pale gums, the listless limbs, the profound weakness. A memory stirred distant but sharp. A memory of her father, the chef, in his bustling New Orleans kitchen. He had spoken of the sailors who would return from long sea voyages, their bodies afflicted with a strange sea-weariness, a malady that no doctor could cure. He called it a hunger of the bones. She rose and went to her luggage, pulling out a heavy leather-bound journal. It was one of a dozen, filled with her father's elegant script recipes, yes, but also notes on food preservation, on the properties of herbs, on the strange sicknesses that came from a lack of life in one's diet. Her true inheritance. Her fingers traced the faded ink. She found the entry. Land scurvy? From a winter diet of only salted meat and milled corn. The body forgets the taste of the sun. The cure is not in medicine, but in the pantry, in life. He listed the remedies: broths made from bone and knuckle infusions of pine needle, and most importantly, any greens that could be found, even the hardy wild weeds that grew by the water, rich with life. She looked up from the page, her heart pounding with a terrible, brilliant clarity. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't a spiritual shadow. It was starvation. A hidden, creeping starvation in a town full of food. She brought the book to Isaac, showing him the passage. He read it, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Greens," he said, skeptical. "There's nothing but snow and frozen mud out there." "There are things if you know where to look," Eleanor insisted, her voice firm with a new purpose. "Pine needles, the roots of the burdock by the creek. They hold life." "Isaac, I think I can help them." He looked from the book to his wife's face, which was illuminated by the firelight, in a fierce, intelligent hope. He saw the town gripped by fear and ready to turn on her. He saw the doctor's failure, the preacher's poison, and he saw his wife holding a truth that was more powerful than either. His choice had already been made weeks ago. "All right, Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with a resolve that matched her own. "What do we need?" She had the cure. It was written in faded ink in a language the town had forgotten how to speak. But how do you offer medicine to a town that is convinced you are the disease? The blacksmith's forge fell silent. The rhythmic, life-affirming clang of the hammer was replaced by a new set of sounds, the steady chop of a knife, the gentle simmer of a large pot, the rustle of dried herbs. Their small home, once a sanctuary from the town's scorn, had transformed into a command center for a quiet, desperate war. Eleanor worked with a focused intensity, her father's journal propped open on the table. She directed Isaac, her voice calm and sure. He, in turn, followed her instructions without question, his large, powerful hands, usually so at home with iron and fire, now surprisingly deft at grinding pine needles into a fine, fragrant powder and feeding the stove with a steady supply of wood. The air filled not with the scent of coal smoke, but with the rich, savory aroma of bone broth and the sharp, clean smell of wild garlic and wintercress she had found by the frozen creek bed. They were brewing a cure. They were cooking up a rebellion. News from the town filtered in like a disease itself. The Miller twins were weaker. The Gable boy had taken to his bed entirely. And then came the news that solidified their resolve. "It's the judge's son, Isaac," said, returning from a tense trip to the mercantile for salt. His face was grim. "Thomas. Dr. Adams was there all night. They say he won't last through the week. The whole town is praying." Eleanor looked at the rich steaming soup in the pot. It was ready. It was a distillation of her secret knowledge, a brew of life in a town obsessed with death. Praying wasn't enough. "Then we cannot wait for them to ask," she said, her voice firm. She ladled the thick, fragrant soup into a heavy iron pot and wrapped it in clean linen to keep it warm. Isaac looked at her, his heart a mixture of pride and profound fear. "They will not let you in, Eleanor. Beatrice Croft. She will slam the door in your face. She will call you a witch." "I know," Eleanor replied, her eyes meeting his. "That is why you must come with me." Their walk through Providence was a silent ordeal. The townsfolk, huddled in small, fearful groups, stopped their whispering to stare as they passed. They saw the blacksmith and his strange large wife walking with a covered pot toward the judge's house. They looked like figures from a dark fairy tale marching toward the dragon's den. The Croft residence was the largest house in town, a two-story monument to wood and wealth, its windows dark and watchful. It felt like a house in mourning. Isaac knocked on the heavy oak door. It was thrown open by Beatrice Croft herself. Her face was pale and drawn from sleepless nights, but her eyes, when they landed on Eleanor, were filled with a raw, undiluted hatred. "What do you want?" she hissed, her body blocking the doorway. "Have you come to gloat witch? Have you come to watch my son die?" Eleanor stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "No, Mrs. Croft," she said, her voice impossibly calm. "I have come to help him. I've brought him some soup." Beatrice let out a laugh, a harsh, broken sound on the edge of a sob. "Soup, my son is dying, and you bring him." "Soup," her voice rose to a near shriek. "Get away from my house. Your shadow is a curse on this family. Leave us to our grief." She moved to slam the door. A large, calloused hand shot out and stopped it, the wood groaning against the force. Isaac. He stood behind Eleanor, a silent, immovable mountain. He looked at Beatrice, his usual kindness replaced by a look of cold, hard anger she had never seen before. "Beatrice," he said, his voice low and firm like tempered steel. "The doctor has given up. Your prayers have gone unanswered. My wife," he said the words with a fierce, protective pride, "is offering you the only thing left in this town, a chance. You can let your pride kill your son, or you can let her in." The two women stood frozen, locked in a battle of wills. Just then, a new figure appeared in the hall behind Beatrice. It was Judge Croft, his shoulders slumped, his face a gray mask of despair. He had heard it all. He looked at his wife's face, contorted with hatred. He looked at the strange, calm woman on his doorstep, and her resolute husband. And he thought of his son wasting away in the room upstairs. His desperation finally mercifully outweighed his prejudice. "Let her in, Beatrice," the judge said, his voice a weary, defeated rasp. His wife turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But William, she is here," he interrupted, his voice breaking. "And Dr. Adams is not. What more can we possibly lose?" Beatrice Croft stepped aside, her face crumbling into a mask of bitter defeat. Eleanor took a deep breath and walked across the threshold into the house of her enemy. She carried the steaming pot like a shield. In the silent waiting house, it was hard to tell which was more dangerous, the sickness or the cure. The inside of the judge's house was a world away from Eleanor's small, warm home. It was a place of dark, heavy furniture of polished wood that gleamed but held no warmth, and of a deep, suffocating silence broken only by the ticking of a tall grandfather clock in the hall. The air was stale, thick, with the cloying, medicinal scent of failure. It smelled of sickness. Beatrice Croft led the way, her back rigid with resentment. She did not take them to the kitchen, but directly up the grand staircase to the master bedroom where the boy lay. Isaac followed them, stopping at the doorway, a large, silent guardian whose presence made it clear he would not leave his wife alone in this house of enemies. The room was dim, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the dying afternoon light. Thomas Croft lay in a great canopied bed, a small, fragile figure lost in a sea of white linen. His hair was damp with sweat, his skin had a translucent, waxy pallor, and his breathing was shallow, a faint rattling sound in the oppressive quiet. He was fading. A ghost already. Eleanor walked to the bedside, placing the still warm pot on a nearby table. The rich, savory aroma of the soup of life of the earth began to fill the room, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of death. "He will not eat," Beatrice said, her voice a sharp, brittle whisper from the corner of the room. "Dr. Adams has tried. I have tried. You are wasting your time." Her words were a prayer for Eleanor to fail. Eleanor paid her no mind. She ladled a small amount of the thick broth into a bowl and sat on the edge of the bed. She touched the boy's forehead. It was cold and clammy. "Thomas," she said, her voice a low, gentle murmur, a sound utterly out of place in this house of harsh judgments. "Just a little soup now, for strength, to make you warm." She held the spoon to his pale, cracked lips. The boy did not respond, his eyes remaining closed. She did not force it. She simply held it there, letting the warm, fragrant steam rise in invitation. "A plea. He will not take it," Beatrice hissed. Eleanor ignored her, her focus entirely on the child. "It's from my father's recipe," she whispered, as if sharing a secret with the boy. "He said it could chase the shadows away." Slowly, as if drawn by the gentle power of her voice, the boy's eyelids fluttered. He turned his head slightly toward the spoon. His lips parted, and he took a tiny, hesitant sip. It was a victory so small it was almost invisible, yet it echoed through the silent room like a cannon shot. He swallowed, and then he took another. Eleanor did not push him. She fed him a few more spoonfuls until his eyes drifted shut once more, this time into what seemed a more peaceful sleep. She set the bowl down. "I will stay," Eleanor stated quietly, turning to the judge who had been watching from the doorway, his face an unreadable mask. "The first few hours are important." The night was a long, slow vigil. Isaac remained by the door, a steadfast presence. Judge Croft sat in a chair in the corner, silent, watching. Beatrice paced the hall like a caged panther, her hatred warring with the sliver of hope she could not extinguish. The clock in the hall ticked away the minutes, each one a small eternity. Eleanor sat by the bed. She bathed the boy's forehead with cool water. She whispered stories to him in his sleep, stories of the bayou, of strange and beautiful birds of a world filled with color and life. She was not just tending to his body, she was tending to his spirit. Sometime deep in the night, the change came. The boy stirred in his sleep, a low moan escaping his lips. Eleanor was instantly at his side. She felt his forehead. A single, perfect bead of sweat had formed at his temple. The clammy cold was gone, replaced by a clean, natural warmth. The fever was breaking. He opened his eyes. They were no longer dull and vacant, but clear, though filled with a weary confusion. He looked at the strange large woman sitting by his bed. "I'm thirsty," he whispered, his voice a tiny raspy thread of sound. Judge Croft shot to his feet, a strangled cry of relief catching in his throat. He looked at his son, truly awake for the first time in days. Then he looked at Eleanor, and the pride, the prejudice, the judgment in his eyes all crumbled away, leaving only a raw, stunned gratitude. She had done what no doctor, no prayer, no amount of wealth could do. She had brought his son back from the edge. She had saved the son of her greatest enemy. And in doing so, she had not won a battle. She had just changed the very nature of the war. Dawn broke not with the gray, oppressive light of the day before, but with a thin, watery gold that promised a break in the storm. Inside the Croft house, the air had changed. The oppressive scent of sickness was beginning to recede, replaced by the lingering earthy aroma of Eleanor's broth. Judge Croft had not slept. He had sat in the chair all night watching the woman his wife had called a witch tend to his son with a quiet, tireless competence he had never witnessed in his life. He watched as the fever finally broke, as the boy's breathing eased, as life, fragile but tenacious, flowed back into his small body. When the sun rose, he looked at Eleanor not as an outcast, but as a miracle worker. The news spread through Providence the way only bad news usually does, with the speed of a wildfire. But this was good news. The judge's son had not only survived the night, he was better. He had taken soup. He had spoken. By mid-morning, the first pilgrim arrived. It was Mrs. Gable, her face a ravaged mask of sleeplessness and terror. Her own son had taken a turn for the worse during the night. She stood on the grand porch of the Croft house, twisting her apron in her hands, her eyes filled with a desperate, pleading shame. Beatrice Croft answered the door. For a moment, the two women, the town's first lady and a simple merchant's wife, stood in silence, united by a mother's primal fear. "They say," Mrs. Gable began, her voice cracking, "they say, the blacksmith's wife, my boy Beatrice, he's so cold." Beatrice's pride, a fortress of granite, finally crumbled. She did not speak. She simply stepped aside and nodded toward the kitchen, where Eleanor was already preparing another larger pot of soup. It was a silent, profound surrender. One by one they came. A slow, somber procession of mothers, their faces etched with fear, came to the door of the blacksmith's house. They came not with scorn, but with empty bowls and pleading eyes. Eleanor met each of them with the same unwavering grace. She filled their bowls. She gave them small bundles of the herbs she had gathered. She shared her knowledge freely, teaching them how to find the wild garlic and pine shoots, how to brew the broth. She was not just healing their children, she was healing the town of its most bitter sickness, its ignorance. Her small kitchen became the true heart of Providence, a place of warmth and steam, and the quiet, powerful magic of simple compassion. A week later, the town held another Sunday social. The mood was not celebratory, but one of quiet, somber gratitude. The children were there, pale and thin, but their laughter, weak as it was beginning to return to the church hall. When Isaac and Eleanor walked in, a hush fell over the room. But this time it was not a silence of judgment. It was a silence of respect. The crowd parted for them. Judge Croft, looking 10 years older, stood before the entire town. "We have been tested," he said, his voice heavy. "And in our fear, we were unkind. We were wrong." He looked directly at Eleanor. "This community owes its life, the lives of its children, to the wisdom and grace of one person. To Mrs. Eleanor Isaacs. We thank you." It was a public apology, a formal unwriting of the town's sin. Later, Eleanor saw Beatrice standing alone by the refreshment table, a cup of punch untouched in her hand. She looked lost, a queen without a kingdom. Eleanor walked over to her. "Your son, Mrs. Croft," Eleanor asked gently. "How is he feeling?" Beatrice flinched, unable to meet her eyes. "He is well." She mumbled the word, costing her a world of pride. "Thank you." Eleanor nodded. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small handwritten recipe card. She placed it on the table beside Beatrice's cup. "It's the recipe for the soup," she said softly. "So, you have it for next winter. The secret is the wild garlic. It holds the most warmth." She turned and walked back to her husband's side. She had not come for apologies or thanks. She had come to offer a cure, and she had given it freely. Isaac took her hand, his large warm fingers enclosing hers. They walked out of the hall together, not as outcasts, but as the quiet, undisputed heart of the town they had saved. Their home was no longer an island. It was a harbor. and the coming winter no longer felt so cold.